Was the Border Patrol justified in tear-gassing migrants at the border? Will the Senate rebuke President Trump on Saudi Arabia? And why did Trump reject his own administration's findings on climate change? And find out what the media missed in our most underreported stories of the week. I'm Adam Bearne, and this is The Square Circle. Hello and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Bearne. Joining us today are Stephenie Foster of Smash Strategies, conservative commentator Valerie Greenfeld, and Rachel Tripp of Young Voices. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
This week witnessed a spectacle at the US-Mexico border in Tijuana as Border Patrol agents used tear gas to disperse a crowd of migrants. Here's the story from NBC News.
Mexico now says about 100 of the people who rushed a major border crossing on Sunday have been arrested and deported. According to U.S. officials, they were mostly adult men.
Are you comfortable tear-gassing children like what we saw?
They're not, as you know, they're not. They had to use because they were being rushed by some very tough people.
So, Rachel Tripp, was the tear gassing of these migrants justified in your opinion?
You know, I do believe that it was. I think that since this caravan took shape several weeks ago, there has been a very singular message which has said very clearly that this caravan is not wanted, that they will not get through the border, that there will not be any progress made were they to get to the United States border. And once they did, there was a shock around what I see as a necessary de-escalation of what could have been a very violent physical issue.
But most of these migrants were unarmed, weren't they? Including women and children, some that were barefoot.
I think that it's shameful of the caravan to push forward women and children to the front. It's the same as when other enemies of the United States or other people around the world use child soldiers or use children as human shields. It is a very unfortunate optic, but they didn't have to do that.
So it's an optic, and I'm not sure that migrants can be compared to child soldiers.
I think that pushing children and women forward to what is obviously going to be a hostile greeting and what has said by many times by the administration and by Border Patrol that they could expect that hostile greeting is knowingly putting children in danger.
Okay, Stephenie Foster, should they have received a hostile greeting?
Well, I disagree. I mean, respectfully, I think that these are people, despite the numbers that the president puts forward right now, it sounds like in Tijuana there are about 8,000 people at the border. They're, by the way, keeping their own lists of who is in lists for asylum so that as they get called up by the border, the immigration people, that they can actually do it in an orderly way. So they are kind of organizing themselves. I mean, I don't think that these people are not seeking to cross the border illegally. They are here to seek asylum. They have a legal right to seek asylum. So to me, I mean, if there were people who were violent and who were causing disorder, there are better ways to stop them than tear gas, which we don't use in war. We could use pepper ball munitions, which are much more sort of targeted and get at people who are actually violent. So I think it's an overreaction. Again, we all would agree, I think, on this panel that our immigration and asylum system needs to be probably overhauled and thought through. But I do think this was an overreaction and there was no need to use tear gas.
Was it an overreaction, Valerie Greenfeld?
I don't think so. I agree with what you said. The problem is that when you use tear gas, I agree, it's not so great for those that are receiving it, but they shouldn't be there and they shouldn't be crowding, trying to get over our border. Secondly, it's a sign to the other people that may want to come in the future that it's a bad idea. You know, if you continue to welcome them, then more people will come. If we make it clear that you're not going to get over the border and nothing good is going to come of this, then maybe they'll stay where they are and try to get asylum, you know, in Mexico or somewhere before they get to Mexico and stop. Also, I wanted to say that we don't know who these people are. I've heard that 90% of them are men, you know, males that are not children, mothers and children, and this kind of thing. We don't know who they are. Are they terrorists? Are they, you know, dangerous? You know, they could be anybody, and we just don't know.
But Stephenie Foster makes the point that it is legal to come to the US to claim asylum. So why not let the migrants come, claim asylum? They have that background check and that vetting process.
Mm-hmm.
and
well,
then
I don't have
go
a
with their
problem
claims
with that,
from there?
but let's do it. Let's do
The
it
administration
properly.
does.
We don't have to do it by pushing the border and by coming as groups of 9,000 people. I mean, we can't process 9,000 people at the same time. There is a process to do it, and they don't have to be pushing the border to do it at that time. There are plenty of ways to do it properly.
Well, you actually have the right to go to a country and claim asylum in that country. So there are a lot of people. Smaller numbers, like 100 people, can be processed today. The migrants themselves, the asylum seekers, are keeping a list so that they are being fair to each other about who gets called next to go, because apparently our government can't
We can't process
do
9,000
that.
people.
Well,
at
so
one
we
time.
can't keep a list. I mean, we certainly should be able to keep a list so that, we get a ticket at the grocery store for 1, 2, whatever the number is. But people do have that right, and I think we confuse a lot of things in this debate. I think it's very important, though, as people are seeking asylum, they have the right to do that, and they have the right to do it by coming to a country and seeking it at that country's border.
Rachel?
If physical safety were the main primary goal, I do think that they've walked through many countries where they would have found more immediate physical safety. If their goal was truly that they couldn't sleep in their beds at night without fearing physical harm, they have walked through many territories, many countries where they could have got that safety or sought that assistance. I think the fact that they've walked up to the border, assuming that they're going to be greeted peacefully, despite the fact that we've warned them not to, is really arrogant on their part.
Is Mexico as safe as the United States?
If they are looking for immediate physical safety, it's not a comparison of which is the safest, it is safety.
Okay.
Do they
so
have
there's no part
safety?
of you that feels that people who walk thousands of miles might be really desperate to get here?
I think that there is a role for empathy when we are considering the way that we approach our immigration status. I think that if we allow people to walk across borders, to walk up to our border and seek asylum, then we are sending a dangerous message to people who are not necessarily people that we want to grant asylum or entry to.
But you don't have to grant them
Agreed.
asylum. If they come and they say, and you realize they're not in danger, they're here perhaps primarily for economic reasons, then the country has a right to turn them away at that point.
We have a system for vetting and including or discluding different kinds of people who want to come into the United States. And if we allow people to just walk up to the border and demand asylum, then it is sort of going against our own system of law, which would be hypocritical and also very contrary to the message that we've been very consistent about giving.
And
But
when
that
we have
actually is the
9,000
law.
people.
That's international law, and people have done that for a very long time. So you may disagree with that law, but that is the system we have, and people have, knowing this from working in the State Department, people are vetted for, whether they're for asylum seekers or refugees in pretty intense ways. So I think the system is set up, and it's not perfect, but to find out if people who are coming to our border, again, either as refugees or asylum seekers, if they're the kind of people we want to leave and, let into the United States, we certainly need to be careful about that. But that is their legal right, and it's not as though it just started a couple of days ago. This has been a system that's been in place for a fairly long time.
But are they so unsafe in Mexico? They are in a country that is okay for them to, if they're escaping some country where they're being persecuted, they have at least gone into one where they're safe. And to say, well, we have to go another one, that's no longer asylum. They are in a place where they're not, about to be murdered or put in jail or something. So
I'm just curious, do either of you accept that migrants play a critical role in the US economy, in agriculture and other types of jobs?
Sure.
That we actually need these people to come to America?
I'm happy to have anybody in America and be pro-immigration if it's done legally.
Like coming to the border and claiming asylum?
This is not legal what's going on here. They're
It
all
is
trying
legal.
to push over, they're trying to push in, and it's not an orderly manner where you stand in line like you say and you get your number and you put your information in. That's no problem, but that's not what's going on here.
Okay. Well, right now I'd like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, or via Facebook or Twitter, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air towards the end of the show. Also this week, the US Senate is considering a resolution on withdrawing US support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. It comes in response to the Trump administration's handling of the Jamal Khashoggi murder investigation. So, Valerie Greenfeld, why does the US Senate not trust the Trump administration's policy in Saudi Arabia?
I don't think that's necessarily true at all. I think it's a very complicated issue. With the Khashoggi peace, in addition to the Yemenis war, there are many signals that we have to, that the president does not want to send. with regard to the war. We want to remain friends with Saudi Arabia, even though we can be critical about what happened with Khashoggi. Right now, Saudi Arabia is on our side, is on Israel's side, trying to create a coalition against Iran. And since Iran is helping Yemen, we want to make sure that those lines are clean, that we don't muddy the waters with regard to our support for Saudi Arabia.
Are we being critical enough with Saudi Arabia when it comes to Khashoggi?
I think Khashoggi, he was not an American citizen.
He's a U.S. resident, permanent resident.
He was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was friends with Osama bin Laden. This is not, your choir boy. This is somebody that, there were internal issues with MBS, I'm sure, but I don't know necessarily that that's our issue for us to decide what internally should happen in Saudi Arabia. I believe that our job is to walk the line, and I think that's what Trump is trying to do. And I think the Senate might be pushing a little bit too hard, but we'll see.
Okay, well, I might have missed the evidence linking Khashoggi to bin Laden, but the U.S. Senate, what do you think, Stephenie Foster, is driving this resolution there?
Well, I worked in the Senate, so it's interesting to me to sort of watch this process. And I think what you're seeing is that we're at a bridge too far for many senators, including people who have previously or have been and are supporters normally of the Trump administration. Lindsey Graham, Bob Corker, people who have been out there and have been supportive in general of what the Trump administration has done. I think this is saying, this is just too much. We need to take serious action against the Saudis, and I think this is one thing that the Senate is considering, whether or not to invoke the War Powers Act and to move forward. So that's one possible set of interventions, right, on our behalf, on behalf of the United States, to really send a strong signal to the Saudis. The Magnitsky sanctions, sanctioning people on the list, and making sure that they can't enter the United States, another thing to do. So I think right now what we're seeing is there's a lot of consternation in the U.S. Senate about what to do to really try to send the strongest possible signal of outrage about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and the fact that, from my personal opinion, and again, I wasn't there, but I think it was probably ordered by the Crown Prince. So this is a very difficult situation. I think the Senate is really trying to get answers. From what I know, they were upset that Gina Haspel, the CIA director, was not there to testify, even though she's listened to the tape and she's been to Turkey to really talk to officials. So I think there's a lot going on about the Senate exercising its privilege, but also being concerned that a lot is going on and that we need to take a strong stand.
Yeah, Rachel Tripp, why do you think that Gina Haspel, the CIA director, wasn't allowed to talk to or didn't talk to senators in this briefing?
I understand the senators' outrage around this. I feel like they feel as though that they have been not given access to a lot of critical information that would inform their decision. I think when it comes to whether or not she should have briefed them, I think that they should have been given access to that information. But obviously, from a Trump administration perspective, that would not have been helpful to their argument, right? And so I think that it was probably a move on the behalf of the executive to say, this is information that we want to command the narrative of and help push this resolution in the direction that we want it to go in. Was that necessarily the right way to approach it? No, I don't think so. I understand the senators' outrage, but I think that was really what was underneath that.
Yeah, certainly some of the senators saying that it was coming from the White House, Haspel's lack of attendance at the briefing. But the Sanders-Lee resolution, which is what the Senate's discussing, is Bernie Sanders brought it up because of the war itself in Yemen that the Senate has never approved of American involvement in, and the fact that it's a humanitarian catastrophe which could lead to the starvation of millions of people. How important a role do you think that should play in this decision?
I think that it should play a larger role than it is. I believe that the senators' vote on whether or not to move forward with this resolution is really motivated by wanting to punish Trump for not giving them that access to information around the Khashoggi murder. I personally think that the United States' influence in that region is extremely important in terms of our own relationships with Saudi Arabia and also being able to make an influence in terms of how we can support Israel. But in terms of the effect that it should have, I think that most senators are thinking that they just want to punish the Trump administration instead of actually thinking about the war itself.
I agree with that, and I'm cautioned by that because U.S. foreign policy should not be made based on vendettas against the president. These are very, very important decisions, and they affect millions of people, literally, when we talk about Saudi Arabia and all of the complications that are going on between the United States and Saudi Arabia relationship right now. I think that it would be too bad if the Senate went in and really messed up that relationship that we've been working so hard to progress with.
And finally tonight, President Trump has dismissed a report from his own administration on climate change. Here's the footage from The Guardian.
I've seen it, I've read some of it, and it's fine.
They say economic impact is devastating.
Yeah, I don't believe it.
You don't believe it?
No, I don't believe it. And here's the other thing. You're going to have China and Japan and all of Asia and all of these other countries, addresses our country. Right now, we're at the cleanest we've ever been, and that's very important to me. But if we're clean, but every other place on earth is dirty, that's not so good. So I want clean air, I want clean water, very important.
Okay, so Stephenie Foster, what do you make of President Trump's assessment of the report?
Well, I mean, I would say this. There were 1,000 people who worked on this 13-agency, interagency report, and they came to this conclusion. It's, one in a series of reports that have come out over the last several years, but particularly this year, really setting forward the dire nature of where we are in terms of climate change. So I would say everyone can make their own decision, but I go with the experts and the people who've studied this. I think one thing we need to remember about climate change is that it's really a national security issue and a global security issue. As climate gets worse, there are more droughts, more floods, food insecurity creates wars massively. That's, a lot of wars occur because of those natural disasters and food insecurity. Here at home, we know that there'll be decreased crop production. Industries like dairy and soybeans and oyster farming and all that are really going to lose large parts of their income. So this is a serious issue, and there are things that can be done. Obviously, every country needs to play its part. That's why the Paris Agreement was a big thing, the Paris Agreement for Climate Change, which we have pulled out of those voluntary sort of standards. So I do agree with President Trump that every country needs to play its part, but we do too. And I think this is a seminal moment, and all of the reports that have come out say that this is kind of the time we have before things get so bad that our world is basically careening off into instability, essentially, and insecurity.
And Valerie Greenfeld, this report says that this is already making life harder for Americans with stronger and larger hurricanes and worse wildfires. Do you believe the scientists with this report?
I can't doubt them. I'm not a scientist, but I can say that I think there are a lot of other things that impact our environment. For example, the fires in California recently, it's horrendous. So many people were killed and lost their homes, and it's a terrible thing. But coming from Colorado, as I do, my parents have a ranch in the mountains, and my father would always tell me that you have to cut trees down in between so that the brush doesn't make the fires continue. And if you don't thin the forests, then their odds of having a fire are greater. And so the environmentalists that do not agree with cutting down trees, those laws in California are steady, so they cannot thin the trees, and that creates bigger possibility of fires.
So the fire officials there say that it's years of drought that has led the trees and the undergrowth to become much more dry, and that's why these fires are so explosive. It's not to do with forest management.
I agree that that's a part of it, and it's also similar in Colorado because we have such a dry climate there. But there are ways that we can prevent the fires beforehand. And what happened here, once it's done, it's out of control. The wind is blowing. There's nothing can be done. So I'm not disagreeing with the report itself, but I think that there are things that can be done to help the environment and help keeping some of the things that you mentioned from happening that we should be doing.
Yeah, maybe we should get away from forest fires specifically because there's been a lot of debate about that recently. But Rachel Tripp, where do you stand on this larger issue of climate change and the president's approach to it?
Sure. Well, I think that this report was one that was obviously based on something that I hope that many people by now can agree to be true, that climate change is real, that it's happening. I think the bigger debate is it man-made or are there other factors at play? And I think that the biggest...
It's not a large debate though, is it?
I think it is. I think it's a pretty legitimate debate around what percentage of what we've seen in terms of climate change is man-made and what part of it is a natural process that occurs over time. And what we do have to do is consider what actions can we take as a global community and as the United States to make sure that we do prevent this from having an impact on our day-to-day lives, from having an impact on our climate moving forward, but also in a way that doesn't necessarily overregulate or harm industries or harm our economy.
Do you accept that the overwhelming majority of scientists say that this is a man-made phenomenon?
I understand that there's a lot of evidence on both sides, and I think that what we can do going forward from both arguments is say, what can we do that will keep our economy healthy and our planet healthy?
Okay, I would disagree with the sentiment. There's a lot of evidence on both sides. Where do you stand there?
I disagree with that also, but I think one thing that we need to debunk is that obviously there's an economic impact of climate change in terms of what it's going to impact farmers, et cetera, but there are a lot of jobs that can be created in terms of, jobs that can address sort of the climate change issues, try to really address some of the technology to capture wind and solar. And so I think we need to be looking also is that this is a tremendous time for technological innovation, and it can actually create jobs. Different kind of jobs that aren't as dangerous, jobs that really help us go to the next level, whether it's, I read an article about people sort of farming in the ocean in terms of new food sources and, of course, capturing other energy sources. So I think we need to really look at this in terms of its impact on the economy in a negative way, but also the possibilities of green jobs and jobs that can really help us both give people livelihood but address the crisis.
Okay, so we can address the crisis and create jobs and boost the economy.
And who could argue with that?
Rachel Tripp, would you argue with that?
So for me, I agree. I think that there's a lot to be said for wind and solar. I think it's important that we investigate all avenues for making lives better for people, for giving people more access to power and to energy and fuels and jobs. But that being said, I think that we shouldn't replace one with the other. I think just because we want to investigate new ways to create energy cleanly doesn't mean that we should necessarily disband and or heavily regulate the methods that we're already using.
Okay, thank you very much. And now it's time to take some questions from our viewers. And we start with one from Clifton Adams, who says, of all the migrants in the caravan, what percentage would you say have legitimate asylum claims? So obviously, probably pretty difficult to tell exactly, but if you were going to estimate.
Well, I mean, what we know is that migrants, or asylum seekers who are coming from Central America are mainly fleeing countries where there's tremendous violence. And El Salvador, et cetera. And these are places that people have legitimate reasons to be fearful for death based on, a lot of factors. And so I don't know what percentage, but it's probably a fairly large one, I would guess. And I think the other thing we should think about as well is what can we be doing as the United States government and other donor governments to really try to address those driver factors in Central America so that hopefully less people feel the need to seek asylum outside their countries.
Okay, Valerie, if you had to guess a percentage.
I have no idea. But again, once they're in Mexico, they're not in the situation that they were in with the countries that you were just discussing. So I think we need to make it clear that you're safe in Mexico and trying to come over the border illegally is not going to work. Therefore, more people will stop doing that and try to go the legal route, which is what we should be pushing for.
Okay. And Rachel, is anyone going to give us a number? Will you give us a number?
I have no idea.
It's really not a fair answer to give a number, but what I will say is that what we can learn from all this is that both sides, no matter what your stance is on the asylum seekers, there's very clear signals here that we need to rebuild and reevaluate the way that we are approaching immigration, because clearly America is built on immigrants, and it is very important that we include them in the fabric of our society. But we need to do so in a way that is legal and that doesn't create perverse incentives.
Okay. And what did you think about Stephenie's point about perhaps helping the situation in these Central American countries that are so violent so that less people will want to come here?
I think that it depends on what we consider to be the right form of assistance, right? I think in terms of the United States' involvement with other governments internationally, that hasn't proven historically to be super effective or the best path forward. I think this concept of, government intervention is not usually the right answer, but hopefully we can find ways to help in humanitarian ways.
Well, I would say one last thing on that. I mean, we did intervene fairly heavily in Colombia, which was a very drug-ridden country. We're now, 20 years later, the war is somewhat over, right? There's a peace agreement with the FARC. It's a much safer place. So we did intervene in a place and really take very concerted action to try to address violence that was driving people from leaving Colombia. So we also do some of those similar things in Central America. We should probably be doing more. So that's historically sort of the context.
Yeah, is that what you would like to see, Valerie?
I think that if we can find a way to go in and help without cutting and running like we do so often, because often when we do that, it makes the situation worse, and we use resources incorrectly and actually harm the people that we're trying to help. So I think if we have a plan and we can follow it and all the way through, I have no problem. It's just that our government in general, that's not our best area to go in and help another country in that way.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll get our next question now, comes from Carol Ruiz, I'll try that again, who asks, if the border agents were being attacked, then instead of using tear gas, what should they have done? Now, I think you gave us one option with perhaps like pepper ball munitions, is that what you said? And so what do you think, ladies?
Well, it also depends, if people are people being shot at? There were no reports of that, or people throwing rocks. I mean, there are you have to assess the situation and figure out what to do from a law enforcement perspective.
Exactly.
I'm not a law enforcement officer, so I do think people on the ground, have those, they're on the very real time. It's just there are law enforcement officers who have argued that tear gas is not the right response.
I can't make a judgment because I wasn't there, but build the wall. Then we won't have this problem. Build the wall.
Sure, the wall is very heavily enforced there at that border crossing. Then. The wall itself is fairly substantial in that location.
But if they're crossing, and if they're attempting to cross, then the wall should be enough to stop that.
Okay.
But if it's not happening, I don't understand why the wall is not more secure.
Okay, thank you. So now it's time for the most underreported story of the week, and who would like to start?
I'll start.
Okay.
I am very troubled by the fact that the CDC came out, the Center for Disease Control, with numbers today saying that life expectancy is decreasing. Someone born in 2017 is less likely, will not live as long as someone who's born in 2016 or 2015, due in large part to higher rates of suicide and overdoses, a lot of opioid-related deaths. And I think that's a big concern, and that points to two very big public health issues that we need to be paying more attention to.
Okay, thank you very much. Valerie?
Absolutely, I agree. It's a very, very big problem.
Okay, and with your underreported stories?
This week, CNN reported a story. They did a poll, 7,000 people in Europe, about the Holocaust, and unfortunately, 1/3 of the 7 countries that were polled, of the residents there, did not know about the Holocaust or knew very, very little. So it's an educational issue that needs to be fixed and needs to be taught in the proper way. I'm very concerned about that in the United States as well. There are places where our history departments in high schools and colleges are very, very good, but there are certain subjects that people graduate knowing nothing about. And I think this is the Holocaust is something that is very important so that it doesn't happen again. People will rise up against it if they know what it is.
Absolutely. And Rachel, your underreported stories.
Yes. So I read an article this week that said that the president of Mexico is awarding Jared Kushner with one of the most prestigious awards that a Mexican government can bestow upon someone. It is called the Order of the Aztec Eagle, which is a great name, but it's a little bit of an odd choice given some of the current events that we've been discussing. And he will be awarded with that this week in Argentina.
Wow. Well, all I want to know is how I get the Order of the Aztec Eagle, but that might have to wait for now, because that is all for this week. I'm Adam Bearne. Thank you for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.